The suffocating stillness in the cramped conference room aboard the carrier Shokaku was a palpable entity, thicker than the perpetual haze of cigarette smoke. It was August 6, 1942, a date that would forever be seared into the consciousness of the 5 high-ranking Japanese naval officers gathered there, not as a mark of triumph, but as a silent, devastating testament to a war irrevocably lost. Anchored in the deceptively serene waters of Truk Lagoon, the magnificent aircraft carrier lay dormant, her vast flight deck eerily deserted, her cavernous hangar bays echoing with an unsettling quietude that belied the storm raging within the hearts of the men below. For 3 agonizing hours, these architects of naval strategy had been locked in a macabre dance with destiny, poring over a grim tableau of battle maps, casualty reports, and the chillingly prescient intelligence summaries. Each document was another nail in the coffin of their imperial ambitions, painting an increasingly stark and undeniable picture of impending doom. For the past 10 minutes, no one had dared to speak, the silence amplifying the rhythmic creak of the ship and the distant lapping of waves against the hull, each sound a mournful drumbeat accompanying their descent into despair. Finally, Rear Admiral Yamamoto, his usually commanding voice now imbued with a profound weariness, broke the oppressive quiet. His gaze, heavy with the weight of unspeakable truths, swept across the faces of his colleagues, each mirroring his own grim resolve. "Gentlemen," he began, the words cutting through the tension like a shard of ice, "we need to acknowledge what these numbers are telling us. The war is lost." The declaration hung in the air, a stark, irrefutable pronouncement of ultimate failure. No one dared to contradict him. There was no need. The truth, raw and unyielding, was etched into the deep lines of their foreheads, in the haunted, distant look in their eyes. This day, August 6, 1942, marked precisely 2 months since the cataclysmic Battle of Midway, and its devastating implications had finally crystallized into an undeniable reality. Japan had not merely suffered a defeat, it had irrevocably surrendered the strategic initiative of the war, perhaps forever. The very notion of future victory, once a blazing beacon, had now dimmed to a flickering, dying ember. The bitter irony was almost unbearable, a cruel twist of fate that mocked their initial triumphs. Pearl Harbor, that audacious, meticulously planned attack, conceived to cripple American naval power and establish an unassailable Japanese hegemony in the Pacific, had instead become the very catalyst for Japan's ultimate, inevitable defeat. To truly grasp the agonizing journey that led these astute admirals to such a crushing internal concession, one had to rewind the clock a mere 8 months, back to the fateful dawn of December 7, 1941. That morning, Admiral Yamamoto's brilliantly conceived and executed strike plan had achieved a tactical brilliance that reverberated across the globe. Japanese aircraft, launched with a precision born of relentless training, had unleashed a torrent of destruction, sinking or severely damaging 8 American battleships, obliterating 188 aircraft, and tragically claiming the lives of 2,403 Americans. The attack was executed with chilling, almost surgical precision. Almost. The critical, deeply significant failures, initially overshadowed by the stunning tactical success and the euphoria of a nation celebrating a perceived victory, became glaringly apparent to those with a deeper, more strategic understanding of naval warfare. Crucially, the American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, the true harbingers of future naval power, were not in port. They were at sea, untouched, their formidable air power preserved for future engagements. Furthermore, the colossal fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor containing millions of gallons of vital oil, the lifeblood of any modern navy, remained miraculously untargeted. The essential submarine base, poised to become a formidable engine of American undersea warfare, was inexplicably ignored, and the critical repair facilities, indispensable for salvaging and mending damaged warships, remained intact, ready to spring into action, minimizing the long-term impact of the surprise attack. Yamamoto himself, a man of profound strategic foresight and a pragmatic understanding of the vast gulf between American and Japanese industrial might, is famously, though perhaps apocryphally, reported to have uttered after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." While historians continue to meticulously dissect the exact wording and veracity of this quote, extant Japanese naval intelligence documents from early 1942 unequivocally reveal a chilling consensus among Japan's senior admirals. They understood, with stark clarity, that they possessed an agonizingly narrow window of opportunity. Intelligence estimates, stark and unforgiving, grimly suggested that Japan had a mere 6 to 8 months, a fleeting period, before the colossal, relentless might of American industrial production would begin to utterly overwhelm Japan's initial, hard-won advantages in pilot training, naval experience, and strategic positioning. 8 months, a blink of an eye in the grand tapestry of global conflict. By August 1942, that precious window had slammed shut irrevocably. The Battle of Midway, fought in the early days of June 1942, was not merely a defeat. It was the catastrophic, irretrievable turning point of the Pacific War. Japan had suffered the devastating loss of 4 of its most vital and experienced fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not simply steel vessels. They were irreplaceable combat platforms, each a complex ecosystem crewed by a cadre of highly trained, almost irreplaceable pilots. Japan had entered the war with a formidable force of 10 fleet carriers. By August 1942, that number had dwindled to a precarious 6, and 2 of those were laid up for extensive repairs, their operational status uncertain. The United States, meanwhile, was constructing carriers at a breathtaking, almost incomprehensible pace that utterly stunned and demoralized Japanese naval planners. In that somber conference room on August 6th, the admirals meticulously reviewed intelligence reports that laid bare the true, horrifying scope of the unfolding disaster. American shipyards were already churning out over a dozen Essex-class carriers, vessels of immense power and capability, larger and more formidable than anything Japan could ever hope to construct. The first of these leviathans were slated to enter service in early 1943. By 1944, the United States would possess a numerical superiority so overwhelming that any semblance of a coherent Japanese defensive strategy would become utterly, tragically impossible. But the stark numbers of aircraft carriers were merely the preamble to a much larger, more terrifying nightmare. The intelligence reports meticulously detailed the burgeoning, almost miraculous surge in American aircraft production. In 1941, American factories had produced approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories, by stark contrast, had managed to produce a comparatively paltry 5,000ers. This disparity, already significant and troubling, was now widening at an exponential, terrifying rate. American production was accelerating with a relentless, unstoppable efficiency, its factories roaring around the clock, while Japanese production struggled desperately even to maintain current, insufficient levels, hampered by raw material shortages and Allied bombing. By 1943, Intelligence estimates chillingly projected that the United States would produce an astounding 85,000 aircraft annually. Japan, even under the most wildly optimistic and improbable scenarios, would perhaps manage a mere 16,000 dozen, and that was if everything proceeded with an unrealistic perfection. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the daring airman who had meticulously planned and led the first wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor, was present at this August meeting. He was still recovering from severe wounds sustained at Midway, his body bearing the physical scars of battle, but his acute tactical expertise remained invaluable for planning the increasingly desperate and futile operations that lay ahead. Fuchida, with a professional detachment that belied his internal anguish, presented an analysis that systematically devastated what little morale remained in the room. Japanese naval aviation had begun the war with an elite corps of approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. These were men who had undergone years of arduous, specialized training, arguably the finest carrier pilots in the world in December 1941. By August 1942, roughly 40% of them were dead, casualties of the brutal, relentless battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, and the grinding, attritional Solomon Islands campaign. The survivors were utterly exhausted, pushed beyond human endurance, flying multiple perilous missions per day with woefully inadequate rest and dwindling resources. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training programs, plagued by insufficient resources and compressed schedules, were producing perhaps a mere 100 new, carrier-qualified pilots per month. And these fresh recruits possessed a paltry 200 hours of flight time, a stark, terrifying contrast to the 800-plus hours the seasoned veterans had accumulated before the outbreak of hostilities. The qualitative edge, once Japan's greatest asset, was rapidly eroding. American pilot production, conversely, told a story of overwhelming, almost limitless abundance. The United States was training thousands of pilots monthly, drawing from a vast, eager pool of manpower. Their initial training, while perhaps not as intensive in individual hours as the Japanese system, benefited from sheer numbers and an emphasis on practical combat readiness. The sheer volume meant that American losses, however tragic and painful, could be replaced with astonishing rapidity. Japanese losses, however, were proving utterly irreplaceable. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost was not merely a casualty. It was a void that could not be filled, a chink in the armor of a once elite fighting force. Fuchida's chilling calculation revealed that at current attrition rates, Japan would effectively run out of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, regardless of how many carriers they somehow managed to keep afloat. The ships would exist, but the men to fly them effectively would not. The submarine warfare numbers painted an equally grim and increasingly desperate picture. Japanese submarines, despite their sophisticated designs and formidable capabilities, had achieved only minimal strategic success. Their primary deployment was for fleet support and reconnaissance, not the crucial commerce raiding that could truly cripple an enemy's economy and war-making capacity. Meanwhile, American submarines, adopting an aggressive and unrelenting strategy, were beginning to systematically strangle Japanese merchant shipping, severing the vital arteries of the empire. Japan's very survival, its entire industrial and military complex, depended entirely on imports: precious oil from the Dutch East Indies, vital rubber from Malaya, staple rice from Indochina, and critical iron ore from various sources. All of it had to be transported through vast stretches of ocean, waters that were increasingly dominated by American undersea hunters. Admiral Yamaguchi, his face etched with a profound sense of despair, laid out the shipping loss statistics with a heavy, leaden heart. In January 1942, Japan had lost 15 merchant ships. By June, that number had doubled to 30 ships per month. By August, the rate had terrifyingly increased to 40 ships monthly, a relentless hemorrhage of vital resources. The trend line was stark, a terrifying projection pointing towards an inevitable economic and military collapse. At this accelerating, unsustainable rate, by 1944, Japan would not possess enough merchant shipping to maintain even basic economic function, much less support its far-flung, overstretched military operations. And Japan's shipbuilding capacity, severely constrained by dwindling raw materials, limited industrial infrastructure, and the growing threat of Allied bombing, simply couldn't keep pace with the losses. They could construct perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year, a tragically insufficient figure, while simultaneously losing over 300,000 tons annually, and those losses were accelerating month by agonizing month. The strategic situation, encompassing the vast sprawl of Japan's newly conquered empire, was equally dire and increasingly untenable. Japan had, in a mere 6 months, conquered vast resource-rich territories: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and countless strategic Pacific islands. This rapid, sweeping expansion had, however, inadvertently created an impossibly long and vulnerable defensive perimeter, stretching for thousands of miles across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Defending it required dispersing precious Japanese forces across dozens of garrisons, many in isolated locations that were increasingly difficult to supply and nearly impossible to reinforce quickly or effectively. The Americans, by stark contrast, possessed the strategic luxury of concentrating their burgeoning forces with surgical precision. They held the invaluable initiative, the strategic advantage of choosing where and when to strike. Japan was forced into the impossible and exhausting position of having to defend everywhere simultaneously, a truly suicidal strategic posture. This fundamental asymmetry meant that even if the forces were numerically equal, which they emphatically were not, the Americans held an inherent, insurmountable advantage. But the forces were not equal. They were diverging dramatically. American strength was growing exponentially, fueled by an inexhaustible industrial engine, while Japanese strength, spread thin and bleeding, was in a precipitous, irreversible decline. The mathematics of war, stark and unforgiving, were inescapable. One admiral, perhaps clinging to the last desperate tendrils of hope, raised the possibility of a negotiated peace. Perhaps if Japan proposed returning some of its newly conquered territories, the United States, weary of war, might agree to a ceasefire. The suggestion was met with a chorus of bitter, hollow laughter, devoid of any genuine mirth. The admirals, each a keen student of international affairs, had all meticulously read the intelligence summaries detailing American public opinion. Pearl Harbor, rather than demoralizing the enemy, had ignited an inferno of righteous rage within the American public, a fury that Japanese planners had fundamentally, tragically underestimated. The attack, intended to shock America into submission and negotiation, had instead forged an unshakable, absolute determination to destroy Japan completely, to prosecute the war to its unconditional conclusion. American war bonds were oversubscribed with an outpouring of patriotic fervor. Factories were roaring around the clock, running 3 shifts, their machines churning out armaments and supplies with relentless, overwhelming efficiency. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, stepping into roles traditionally held by men, tirelessly fueling the burgeoning American war machine. There would be no negotiated peace, no compromise, no quarter. America wanted unconditional surrender, a complete and total victory, a retribution for the day of infamy. The meeting inevitably turned to the agonizing, soul-searching question of what, precisely, had gone so terribly wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor, while a brilliant tactical success in its execution, had proven to be a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. Why? Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, offered his somber and self-reflective perspective. The attack, he explained, had been meticulously designed with a singular objective: to obliterate American battleship power, thereby granting Japan a crucial 6-month window to consolidate its rapid conquests before America could effectively respond. The underlying theory, a dangerously flawed cornerstone of their strategy, was that after 6 months of humiliating defeats, American public opinion would turn against the war, forcing its government to negotiate a favorable peace. This theory, he painfully articulated, had been revealed as fundamentally and catastrophically flawed on multiple levels. Firstly, battleships, once the queens of the sea, were no longer the decisive weapon in modern naval warfare. Aircraft carriers, with their immense reach and striking power, were. By missing the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, Japan had left America's most potent and vital naval assets untouched, effectively preserving its future striking power. Secondly, American public psychology had been fundamentally and catastrophically misunderstood. The attack had not demoralized. It had galvanized and unified American opinion in a way that nothing else could have achieved, forging a singular national purpose. Thirdly, Pearl Harbor had inadvertently bestowed upon America the undeniable moral high ground internationally, making it far easier for the United States to forge powerful alliances, secure vital resources, and garner global sympathy for its cause. Fourthly, and perhaps most critically, the attack had been too successful in one very specific and ultimately self-damaging way. It appeared as an act of profound treachery. Japanese diplomats were supposed to deliver a formal declaration of war 30 times, minutes before the attack commenced. However, due to systemic delays in decoding and transmitting the lengthy, complex message, the declaration was tragically delivered after the attack had already begun. This egregious blunder, whether intentional or accidental, made Pearl Harbor appear as a sneak attack, a flagrant and unforgivable violation of international norms and diplomatic courtesy. American propaganda swiftly seized upon this monumental error, labeling it a day of infamy, and that potent, infuriating label stuck, deeply embedding itself in the American psyche and handing America a perfect, righteous rallying cry for total war. Admiral Yamaguchi, his voice now a mere whisper, pulled out yet another damning document that further deepened the pervasive gloom in the room. It was a detailed analysis of the Doolittle raid from April 1942. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet, had daringly bombed Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The physical damage inflicted was, in itself, minimal. A few buildings destroyed, a handful of casualties. Militarily, it was largely insignificant. But strategically, the raid had been devastating to Japan's psychological and military posture. It had, with brutal efficiency, shattered the deeply held myth of homeland invulnerability, a cornerstone of Japanese national pride and confidence. It had demonstrably proven that American carriers could approach the Japanese home islands themselves, striking at the very heart of the empire. This forced Japan to retain precious aircraft and troops in the home islands for defense, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere in the expanding, overstretched empire, diverting them from critical fronts. Most importantly, the Doolittle raid had profoundly rattled the Japanese high command, inducing a sense of urgency that prompted them to prematurely accelerate plans for the Midway operation, the very operation that had ended in such a catastrophic and irreversible defeat. The Midway operation itself, conceived in haste and executed with flawed assumptions, deserved intense and painful scrutiny. The plan had been incredibly complex, involving multiple Japanese forces approaching from different directions, intended to confuse and overwhelm American defenders. Instead, this very complexity had inadvertently created severe coordination problems and a dangerous dispersal of forces. The Japanese naval forces were dangerously spread thin, unable to adequately support each other when the crucial moment of contact arrived. Meanwhile, American codebreakers, working tirelessly and brilliantly, had cracked crucial Japanese naval communications and knew precisely where and when the attack would come, rendering the complex deception plan moot. This brought up another critical, systemic failure: intelligence and security. Japanese naval codes were being read by the Americans. Japanese officers, though not fully aware of the full devastating extent of the compromise, knew enough to be deeply worried and distrustful. Every operation plan, every ship movement, every strategic intention was potentially known to the enemy before execution. Fighting a war when your opponent can read your orders, when your every move is anticipated, is a Sisyphean task, nearly impossible to win, akin to fighting blindfolded. The meeting shifted, with a palpable sense of futility, to examine hypothetical alternatives that might have yielded a better outcome than the disastrous path chosen at Pearl Harbor. What if Japan had not attacked the United States at all? What if they had exclusively targeted British and Dutch colonial possessions in Southeast Asia to secure vital resources, avoiding direct confrontation with America? Would America have still entered the war? The consensus was unclear, but deeply unsettling. President Roosevelt clearly harbored a strong personal desire to enter the war against both Germany and Japan, recognizing the existential threat they posed. However, American public opinion in 1941 was deeply, stubbornly isolationist, still reeling from the scars of the previous World War. Without the galvanizing shock of Pearl Harbor, would Congress have declared war? Possibly not immediately. Japan might have gained precious months or even years to consolidate its conquests and fortify its new defensive perimeter without direct American opposition, a vastly different scenario. Instead, Pearl Harbor had delivered Roosevelt precisely what he needed: a unified nation, its isolationist sentiments shattered, clamoring for war and vengeance. Another alternative, considered with profound regret, was: what if the Pearl Harbor attack had been more thorough? What if Nagumo had launched a decisive third wave of aircraft to destroy the massive fuel storage facilities, the vital dry docks and repair facilities, and the crucial submarine base? Some officers had passionately advocated for this at the time, arguing for a complete annihilation of the base's operational capacity. Nagumo, however, had refused, citing understandable but ultimately fatal concerns about potential American counterattacks and his overriding desire to preserve his precious carrier forces for future engagements. In hindsight, this caution, born of tactical prudence, now appeared to be a strategic, fatal error. Destroying those critical facilities might have crippled American Pacific operations, delaying them by 6 months or more. 6 months that Japan desperately needed to consolidate its gains and prepare for the inevitable American counteroffensive. But the admirals, in their grim candor, were forced to acknowledge an uncomfortable, undeniable truth that superseded all tactical considerations. Even a more thorough, utterly devastating Pearl Harbor attack would not have altered the ultimate, inexorable outcome of the war. The fundamental problem was not tactical execution. It was a stark, unassailable strategic reality that dwarfed any single battle or operation. Japan's economy was a mere fraction of America's colossal booming size. Japan's industrial capacity, constrained by its limited natural resources and nascent heavy industry, was perhaps 1/10 of America's manufacturing might. Japan's oil production was essentially zero without imports, making it entirely dependent on vulnerable sea lanes. Japan's population, though significant, was less than half of America's, a critical factor in a war of attrition where manpower was constantly consumed. In a protracted total war of attrition, these overwhelming and fundamental disparities guaranteed ultimate, unavoidable defeat. Yamamoto, with his chillingly accurate prescience, had grasped this grim reality from the very beginning. He had vehemently opposed war with the United States, arguing with unwavering conviction that Japan, lacking the industrial and resource base, could not possibly win a prolonged conflict. He had been tragically overruled by hawkish army leaders and civilian government officials who, blinded by a dangerous cocktail of hubris and racial stereotypes, believed American democracy was weak, decadent, and lacked the moral fortitude and will to fight a long, costly war. They had deluded themselves into believing that a quick series of decisive victories would force American capitulation and a negotiated peace. Every single one of these deeply flawed assumptions was now proving catastrophically, tragically wrong, costing countless lives and the very future of their nation. Captain Fuchida, ever the meticulous analyst, presented the most profoundly depressing and inescapable analysis of all: the dire oil situation. Japan's entire strategic calculus, its very rationale for war, had been built around securing desperately needed oil from the Dutch East Indies. American embargoes had threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military into submission, making the seizure of these oil fields an existential necessity. And Japan had, with brilliant military execution, succeeded in capturing those fields mostly intact. But success, in this context, had merely created new, equally intractable logistical and strategic problems. The vast quantities of oil had to be transported back to Japan. Tankers, slow, vulnerable, and few in number, had to undertake the perilous, agonizingly long journey through vast stretches of ocean, waters that were increasingly infested with relentlessly aggressive American submarines. In January 1942, Japan had managed to import 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, imports had plummeted by a staggering 37.5% to 250,000 tons. The trend was terrifyingly clear and mathematically irrefutable. By 1943, relentless American submarine warfare might cut oil imports to levels utterly insufficient even to maintain basic military operations, let alone fuel their fleet and air forces. Japan would possess the oil fields, but would have no safe, reliable way to get the lifeblood of its war machine home. The wells of victory would be full, but the vessels to carry it gone. The admirals then discussed, with a profound sense of utter futility, whether there was any conceivable path, however narrow, to victory at this point. Perhaps if Japan could inflict enough casualties on American forces, make the cost of advancing so astronomically high that American public opinion would turn decisively against the war, forcing a political shift. This last desperate hope was systematically demolished by grim, objective intelligence assessments. American casualty tolerance appeared far, far higher than Japanese planners had ever anticipated. The brutal realities of the Bataan Death March and widespread reports of egregious Japanese mistreatment of prisoners of war had inflamed American public opinion, making the war intensely personal, a crusade against evil. Americans were not coldly calculating costs and benefits. They were driven by a profound desire for revenge, for justice, for total victory. Casualty lists that might have broken the will of other nations seemed only to strengthen American resolve, deepening their commitment to complete and utter destruction of the enemy. Moreover, American tactics were rapidly evolving to minimize their own losses, demonstrating a strategic and technological adaptability that Japan could not match. American forces were not engaging in suicidal banzai charges, throwing lives away. Instead, they were employing overwhelming firepower, achieving decisive air superiority, and leveraging their immense material advantages to methodically grind down Japanese positions while simultaneously minimizing their own casualties. The Americans were fighting an industrial war, treating it like a vast, complex production problem to be solved through superior resources, innovative logistics, and overwhelming force. A problem for which Japan had no equivalent solution, no answer to this relentless, mechanistic destruction. The meeting concluded with a focused examination of the current, desperate situation in the Solomon Islands, where American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in early August. Japanese forces were fighting with desperate courage and suicidal tenacity to dislodge them, pouring men and materiel into the crucible of battle. But the admirals, with cold strategic clarity, recognized that Guadalcanal represented a chillingly effective new American strategy. Seizing forward bases, rapidly constructing airfields and infrastructure, using those airfields to establish air superiority and dominate surrounding areas, then methodically advancing to the next target in an inexorable island-hopping campaign. It was a methodical, grinding, relentless, and ultimately unstoppable approach, and it was working with devastating efficiency. Japan simply could not match this industrial-scale approach. Japanese logistics were woefully inadequate for such sustained, large-scale offensive and defensive operations across vast distances. Japanese industrial production could not provide enough aircraft, ships, and supplies to match the relentless American reinforcement rates. Every battle was becoming a brutal war of attrition, a test of wills and resources, and Japan was losing the attrition calculus at every conceivable level: men, machines, and materiel. One final damning document was reviewed, its conclusions chillingly stark: an economic analysis prepared by the Finance Ministry. It projected Japanese economic capacity through 1945 under various scenarios, even the most wildly optimistic ones. Even under the best-case assumptions, the analysis showed a complete economic collapse by late 1944. Japan's economy simply could not sustain the gargantuan war effort for more than 3 years in total, starved of resources, crippled by blockade, and battered by attrition. They were now 8 agonizing months into the war. The clock was ticking, mercilessly, relentlessly, counting down to national ruin. The admirals, their faces etched with the profound sorrow of a nation facing its impending doom, reached their devastating, inescapable conclusion. Pearl Harbor had been a fleeting tactical success, a brilliant, audacious execution of a limited objective, but it had tragically proven to be a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. It had achieved precisely nothing Japan truly needed in the long term, while simultaneously unifying and enraging the one opponent Japan absolutely, desperately needed to avoid fighting in a protracted war. The war was now unwinnable. The only remaining question, a truly horrifying one, was how much more destruction, how much more suffering, how many more lives Japan would be forced to endure before ultimately accepting the inevitable, unconditional surrender. Admiral Yamaguchi, his voice now a mere whisper, his spirit broken, proposed recommending to the Imperial General Headquarters that Japan seek peace negotiations immediately, before the situation deteriorated further into an abyss of death and utter national ruin. The proposal was met, not with disagreement regarding the brutal accuracy of their analysis, but with a weary, knowing silence and the subtle shake of heads. They knew such a recommendation would be ignored, or worse, brutally suppressed and branded as defeatism and treason by a military government, intoxicated by its own initial victories, hell-bent on fighting to the bitter, apocalyptic end, heedless of strategic reality and human cost. The meeting concluded with no decisions, no formal recommendations, just a shared, crushing, and silent understanding of the unvarnished, horrifying truth. Japan had, in essence, lost the war on December 7, 1941. It just didn't know it yet. The admirals, their shoulders slumped with the crushing weight of this terrible internal revelation, filed out of the cramped, smoke-filled room, each returning to their duties, to plan operations they knew could not succeed, to command forces in battles they knew were already lost, to fight a war they knew was utterly, tragically unwinnable. The vast, indifferent expanse of the Pacific continued to shimmer under the tropical sun, its tranquil surface oblivious to the quiet, devastating pronouncement of inevitable defeat made within the confines of the Shokaku. August 6, 1942, a day of unspoken surrender in the heart of the Japanese Imperial Navy, a day when the future of an empire became a chillingly finite countdown